Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank Chase Jr. back with you for another installment of our tithing study series. And so I'm going to talk about some new information today prior to my new book coming out. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, I want to kind of give you some insight. First, let me talk about that my new book, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway, will be out soon. So keep on the lookout and check my blog at tithenomore.com. The title of the blog is Are You Confused About Tithing? So today we want to discuss some information about giving. Well, for most people, giving means you have to cough up 10% of your paycheck, gross or net income. And that includes other offerings along with that. And some people teach that you're not really giving an offering until you first have given your tithe of 10%. Well, I want to give you some enlightenment on those beliefs and let you know today that that is not necessarily the case, and the Bible does not teach that you should give 10% of your gross or net income. But I want to talk about some aspects of what I think is important when discussing tithing, is that when we are looking at the Bible, we are dealing with a historical document that goes back to centuries. And so when you're dealing with the Old Testament, it's specifically the people of the Old Testament, which were the Hebrew people. Today we use the word Jews, but the original language, according to the Bible, were the Hebrew people. And so the Hebrew people had a interesting way of looking at giving and sharing. And I want to give this information to you so that you will know how to give and how to share. And this does not mean that I am talking about not giving to your church. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. So let's get the record straight. I am not talking about not giving to your church. I'm talking about giving in general. Who you give to and how much you give is a personal decision, because you should never let your charity be put on Front Street and be known of men, but always give in private. So what's important here? We want to talk about some of the Hebrew Jewish thought on financial support, and that is important. Since churches need support and all nonprofits need support, let's talk about what are some aspects of giving. And we're going to go through some of this, and we're going to give you some information as to how this is all supposed to be done. And I'm going to read some things because it's important, really, really important that you get this. And for some of you, it may lead to financial security in some aspects. The following statement is an indictment against any pastor or titled gospel worker who thinks they have the right or the biblical command to refuse working and to depend on tzedakah. The Hebrew word here for charity or is tzedakah. Tzedakah is the Hebrew word for charity. And we know most people are full-time pastors and full-time elders who pastor churches, but they do not work. Now, I'm not talking about those pastors who incidentally have retired from their careers and are receiving a retirement check and have worked a full-time job and have retired. We're talking about those who just refuse to work today, simply because they think the tithe belongs to them or to their church, and people are supposed to pay it. So let's look at this. And you heard some music in the background while I was speaking, so I'm going to continue to have the music rolling so that you can have some ideas, not just to listen to my voice, but have some nice music in the background. So, the Hebrew word must be understood from the Jewish perspective, and I've already told you that it is tzedakah. The following statement is for Jewish rabbis and teachers. And if so, this caution should also be used for pastors who teach from the Bible. And it should be a warning to all of those in the kingdom of God. who teach the Bible and refuse to work and refuse not to work at all. And this is what a sage once said from the Hebrew Jewish perspective. We have an obligation to avoid becoming in need of tzedakah. And as I said, tzedakah is charity. A person should take any work that is available, even if he or she thinks it is beneath their dignity, but to avoid becoming a public charge. So that's the key point here. We need to avoid, as gospel workers and gospel preachers, avoid becoming a public charge. That we need to avoid becoming completely dependent on the congregation to support our every need. In particular, Jewish legal scholars, teachers, and rabbis must make their living at something other than teaching the oral Torah and relying on charity, even if this entails hardships for them, lest they profane God's name and lose their part in the world to come. Did you just hear what I just said? My goodness. That is a powerful statement. But unfortunately, many rabbis, even pastors today, have failed to take this seriously in recent generations. Some have brazenly gone as far as to say that the public, the church, the congregation, must support them, and they are forbidden to work. Now, I know this is going to not go well with a lot of people, but this is the case. So now we're going to talk about what is tzedakah. And then the Hebrew word is tzedakah, and we're going to talk about what it is. It is charity. This is important though, and I need to make this statement. Giving charity is not just giving money, okay? I know we often feel that way, that we can only give money, but there are other things you can give that will be acceptable. You can give time, you can give energy, talent, and other things if money cannot be given. And God would accept this, even if you didn't have any money. So you don't have to necessarily give money to be acceptable with God. You can give time and charity and talents. Most preachers would not tell you that because money is a priority over other gifts. And that's important. Tzedakah literally means righteousness. Tzedakah literally means righteousness. What is the right thing to do? The right thing to do is, if you can't give money, is to give something else. Maybe give a smile, maybe give some talent, maybe give some energy to a cause. So that's true giving. Since tzedakah literally means righteousness, it means the right response for the situation. Whatever the situation is, that's what you should respond to. Let's say someone on the street is hungry and you want to give charity. Well, the charity you would give to a hungry person is food, and God is accepting of that. If you have a couple of coins for a beggar, that's charity. But if you don't, you can give him a smile and a boost instead, and that is considered tzedakah. Sitting down talking to someone and listening to their problems and giving them some hope is a form of charity. And we often think that everything we do surrounds money, but it does not mean that. And I hope you're getting something out of this. Giving kind words is charity. So where do they get the idea and the authority to say that tzedakah must be 10% of someone's income, or net income, or gross income? They don't have the authority according to the 501c3 government rules. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, 10% of your income is not a requirement in the New Testament. And when my book Kleptomaniac comes out, you will see all of the details. Now, I want to make a specific note here, and I think I might have covered this in some other earlier videos, but I want you to understand this very clearly now. You got to get this. There is an income tithe called Mesa. Mesa is called a tenth. But it is believed that this income tithe is not truly part of the written Torah, and there is debate among rabbis whether this rule, tithing money, is a Torah law or rabbinic decree or command. Now, let me make that perfectly clear to you. There is a Jewish aspect of giving a tenth of income. However, when you study this completely, you will find out that tenth of income actually, according to the Jewish law, according to Jewish rabbis and rabbinic decrees, a tenth of your income goes to the poor and the hungry and the widows and the fatherless and the homeless. And I won't even go into that because my book's going to explain it in even more detail. But however, I will say this. In all of my research in the Bible on tithing, I find no scripture to support a command to tithe income mesa. That's what we call it. A tenth of money is called income mesa, and specifically the words mesa kasafim. Nowhere is it recorded that mesa kasafim, a tenth of money, is ever recorded in the Bible as ever being required by God. Besides, a rabbi's decree is considered oral Torah. Now, let me explain something about the oral Torah. The oral Torah and the written Torah, there's disagreements whether the oral Torah has the same status as the written Torah. And some say the oral Torah is melded into the actual written Torah. But there is no way the oral Torah trumps the written Torah. Some believe that the oral Torah cannot override the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Maybe that's why we find no explicit written commands from God for Israelites to tithe income mesa, because we would have to provide scripture from the Old Testament to the New Testament to empirically prove tithing is a command or encouraged for Gentiles, Christians, and there is no verse to support income mesa in the New Testament or the Old Testament. Income mesa meaning a tenth of your income, gross or net. But there are verses, many verses, there are many verses to support generous giving. And so that's what we're talking about, generous giving. In respect to Jesus, he never mentioned income mesa at all, but only livestock and agricultural mesa in Matthew 23:23. Now, if you read Matthew 23 and 23, it will tell you that he commended that they were tithing spices, but he never mentioned gold, silver, shekels, or any money in that verse. And so that's why we cannot say income mesa or tithe of money is required in the New Testament. Okay, so with that being said, let's look at some more information about what this term tzedakah really is all about. Now, there are 8 levels of tzedakah from the Jewish perspective. And to translate that even further, there are 8 levels of giving. 8 levels of giving that God respects in all aspects of life. And so I'm going to go through these 8 levels, and I'm going to start with the most important to the least important. So the 8th one is the least. The first one is the highest, and descending on down. And you should read these, and I guess what I will do is I will post these tithing slides on my blog at Tithe No More, so you can read them for yourself, along with other information. The great rabbi of the 12th century Egypt, Maimonides, spoke of 8 levels of giving, and most people in today's churches think only money is acceptable form of giving, but it is not. You may not have money, but you can still give in other ways to be a blessing and be blessed. The first level of giving, listen to this. The greatest level, above which there is no greater, is to support a fellow Jew by endowing him, with a gift or a loan, or entering into a partnership with him, or finding employment for him in order to strengthen his hand until he no longer need be dependent upon others. Question: should a pastor who refuses to work consider this statement? Now, that is for all of you out there to determine. And although this is speaking of the Jewish perspective, it also gives us some insight into how we may employ giving in our own lives. Level number 2, a lesser level of charity than this is to give to the poor without them knowing to whom one gives. So you give to the poor without knowing to whom you're giving it to, and without the recipient knowing from who he received it. So you give it to an unknown poor person. The poor person doesn't know you gave it. That's a level of giving that God respects. For this is performing a mitzvah solely for the sake of heaven. Now, what is a mitzvah? And I'm going to read this to you right now because this is important. A mitzvah. A mitzvah. A mitzvah is a precept, a command, or a good deed one does for religious duty. So in the area of giving, you can give based on a mitzvah. Based on a mitzvah. Now I'm going to tell you some more things about this word mitzvah because it's important. It's really important. How do you employ a mitzvah in your life? Let me give you some examples. A mitzvah can be employed in such a way, such as having children. God will bless you for that? Of course. Another example would be, well, as you know, not eating pork. It could be a mitzvah. Declaring God's oneness could be a mitzvah. And building a temple in Jerusalem could be a mitzvah. And providing an interest-free loan to someone could be a mitzvah. So you can loan someone $50, but you don't charge interest. Now we know, as I have discussed earlier, that the Hebrew people in the scriptures were forbidden to charge interest on their fellow Hebrew brothers and sisters. Do not charge interest. However, they could charge interest on people outside of that cultural, religious spectrum. So let's continue with the levels of tzedakah, or the levels of giving and charity. This is really important. Number 3 is the third lesser. A lesser level of charity than this is when one knows to whom one gives, but the recipient does not know his benefactor. The greatest sages used to walk about in secret and put coins in the doors of the poor. As you can see, you can just drop coins in the doors of the poor. Now, they did this years ago, but you can drop dollars in the doors of the poor. It is worthy and truly good to do this if those who are responsible for distributing charity are not trustworthy. Question: does this mean if you don't know what your church is doing with the money, you can give it directly to the true poor? It looks like the giver is responsible for checking out the receiver of the money. So when people tell you, you'll go ahead and give your money, it's not your concern what's being done with it. Well, according to some Jewish perspective and Hebrew perspective, you as a giver have to be responsible with what you give, and you must be very investigative and inspect what you give. So can you ask the church what's being done with the money? Of course. And they should be freely willing to tell you how they are distributing the funds. Now, number 4 is another level of charity, of tzedakah. A lesser level of charity than this is when one does not know to whom one gives, but the poor person does know his benefactor. And that's a good one too. The greatest sages used to tie coins into their robes and throw them behind their backs, and the poor would come up and pick the coins out of their robes so that they would not be ashamed. Wow. As you can see, the giving to the poor has some compassion with it because we're not trying to shame them or make them feel bad because they're poor. The Bible is clear on this also. And though I'm reading from the Jewish Hebrew perspective, you can find these same elements and these same concepts throughout the Old Testament where God goes to defense of the poor when they are mistreated. Question: if you do give money as a tithe and offering to your church, then how do you obey God and help the poor? So how are you doing that if you're not doing it strictly yourself? That means you have to give to the poor directly in this case. But if all of your money is going to the church and you have nothing left to give to the poor, but you're leaving the responsibility of the church to give some of your money to the poor, then you're not a responsible giver. Number five. Number five is a good one. Number five is a real good one. Another level, a lesser level than this, is when one gives to the poor person directly into his hand, but gives before being asked. Question: do you care about the poor so much that you give to the poor before they ask you? So it doesn't necessarily mean you wait for them to stand on the corner and ask for something. It means you intentionally go look for the poor and give them something before they ask. And believe you me, these practices and employing some of these, I can tell you personally that it can have a profound effect on your heart. And number 6 is another lesser level. This is a lower level than all the previous levels. A lesser level than this is when one gives to the poor person after being asked. Question: do you have trouble giving to the poor when they ask you for help? If you do, maybe it's because when you tithe and give offerings, you think that's what God required. Newsflash, folks. God cares more about the poor than you paying a church mortgage or building fund or a tithe. He cares about what you do for the poor. Now, I'm not saying don't give to your church, but I'm telling you where God's priority is. Number 7 is another level. A lesser level than this is when one gives inadequately. Now, here's where it gets where you don't give. What you give is inadequate. And this is a good point. A lesser level than this is when one gives inadequately, but gives gladly with a smile. Question: did you think that if you gave less, it was wrong? Look, if you do it with a smile, then it is acceptable, even if it is not the most adequate gift. So sometimes people can't give what's being asked, and you may have to give an inadequate gift. But when you do it with a smile and gladness, it is acceptable in the sight of God. So that means you may not have the 10% to give. You may not have 7. You may not have 5. Maybe you have just 1. Maybe you have 2. Maybe percentage is not important, but all that you have is $5 or $6, but everybody else is giving 1,000. But if you do it with a smile, it is considered a blessing. So don't be fooled by all the guilt testimonies and guilt sermons that guilt you into thinking you're not giving according to what someone else will tell you to give. But if you do anything with a smile and gladness in your heart, it is acceptable. Number 8 is the least of all giving. A lesser level than this is when one gives unwillingly. Now, this is important because when you give unwillingly, whether you are doing it under compulsion or not, it is not acceptable. You should never give when you are unwilling to do it. Only give when you have a willing heart and gladness, and that is acceptable with God. A lesser level than this is when one gives unwillingly. Comment: if you give with an unwilling attitude under pressure or any form other than willingly, then it is not acceptable to God. You might as well keep the money in your pocket. All giving should be like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:7. Here's how Paul endorses giving. And he endorses this kind of giving from his own Hebrew background. He says, every man, in parentheses, should give according as he purposes in his heart. So let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Now that's important because the 8 levels of giving that I have shared with you so far, all of them deal with some type of cheerfulness of the heart, a willingness. And so, any type of giving that you do that causes you to have grudgingness, or that causes you to give out of necessity, or I need this because we're going to go bankrupt tomorrow, out of necessity, it will not create a situation where you are a cheerful giver. You are cheerful and you give. And the amount is what you purpose in your heart. That's the important thing. So, what is tzedakah? Tzedakah is charity, and it means it is an attitude of giving. So here's what we should always do, is we should always look for legitimate situations where we can give what is needed. That is important. Because too often, giving is more than money. Get that? Giving is more than money. In dealing with money, on the other hand, a warning is given that one should not. Let me say that again. On the other hand, a warning is given that one should not endanger the family budget by thoughtless giving. Comment. If you need charity after you give, you are a thoughtless giver. Wow. And that's important. That is really important here about giving. When you give, do it with a free will heart, with your mind willing and your heart willing. And in each case, you will never go wrong. You will never go wrong if you give with a free will heart and you have a willing heart and a willing mind to do it. And so that's why it is important that we understand how giving is practiced in the Jewish faith, in the Hebrew culture, and how the people gave. Because it is important that when you do give, all giving should be generous. Like I said, all giving should be cheerful. It should be not out of necessity. It should be according to our means. It should be in faith, with love, and in the right spirit. So never give in an unhappy spirit, because it won't benefit you at all. It only benefits the person who receives it, and you get nothing in return. So when you read any of Paul's letters, remember, Paul was a Jew. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and everything he wrote was from a Hebrew perspective. And then the things he talked about in the New Testament about giving, he often drew from the first 5 books of the Bible to instruct on giving, and even for his own support that he was supposed to receive from other churches. And I'm not saying this because I don't want churches to succeed or not have money. We have to have the proper perspective on giving, and that is important. Now, I want to make one more point about giving in the New Testament. Now, I want to say this about the Hebrews and rabbis and all of this stuff that we have been discussing. According to the Wycliffe Commentary Bible, it says it was customary for Jewish rabbis not to receive pay for their teaching. And therefore, I'm going back to Paul, who had been raised a rabbi, had learned the trade of tent making. The apostle did not at once launch into the evangelization of Corinth, but joined Aquila and Priscilla in practicing his trade during the week. The Sabbaths he devoted to preaching in the synagogues. This is Acts 18, 1 through 4. Now, that's why it's important that I gave all those 8 levels of giving, because Paul was a perfect example. He did not at once launch into evangelization of Corinth. He worked in the field of tent making and made money. And from the research that I have discovered, the tent making business was very lucrative. And not only did Paul make money from tent making when he was doing his missionary journeys, he also made money and took care of his cohorts that were with him on the journey. And I think if Paul could work a full-time tent-making job when he said he working with his hands, don't you think today that pastors, we can have full-time jobs, or pastors can have full-time jobs, and yet it will not be a hindrance to preaching the gospel? And so that is the key to true giving and not becoming a public charge. And Tzedakah is the key to all giving. Give from the heart when you're giving charity. This will end this segment of our video of tithing study, and I'll be back with you again with another episode on this, or information on this, and I hope you got something out of it. But until then, we'll see you again soon.